the forecasting and budgeting video. Having a forecast in place will definitely be a key success factor in your business, and it also offers a variety of benefits, including how many products to launch to achieve your targets and goals. Further, having a strong forecast will guide you on when is the right time to exit your business. Topics we'll discuss will be why forecasting is critical to your success. Forecasting is a process, not an event. Forecasting your revenue growth. Budgeting expenses based on growth. And implementing and maintaining a forecast. But quickly, before we jump into it, I wanted to share with you a northbound exit principle. Running a business without forecasting is like driving a car with your windshield cover on, meaning you don't know what path you're headed down, and more importantly, you may crash and burn. Now let's get into it. Without a forecast in place, you'll have lots of unknowns. No forecasting means no business planning. You don't have the ability to assess the growth of a brand, nor will you know when and how many products to launch to achieve your targets and goals. There's no ability to know how much cash you need to grow, no ability to determine the potential future valuation, no ability to analyze the best time to sell, no ability to negotiate a premium valuation, no ability to evaluate your best offer and buyer, and no knowledge of whether your exit might yield a life-changing event. So there's lots of unanswered questions that will occur if you don't have a forecast in place. There are two overlapping purposes of forecasting. One is for you as the seller, and the other is for the buyer. Now, as the seller, you have to understand what you expect to achieve. Now, that's called the base case scenario. In the base case, we'd like you to be about 80% confident that you could achieve these targets, and also feel comfortable putting this forecast in front of a buyer to review. That being said, it's also good to have a best case scenario as well as a worst case. The best case scenario would be your blue sky situation, where it's about 80% chance likelihood that you'll actually hit it. And now on the flip side, it's good to have a worst case in your pocket as well. And this could be anything baked in from our stockouts are going to be doubling this year, or we see increased competition coming in, so our list prices are going to be dropping. And with this forecast, we'd like you to be about 90% sure you're going to hit it. This is the take it to the bank scenario. So it's good to have all three of these forecasts in your mind as you're going to market and just, running your typical day-to-day operations as well. Now, with forecasting, it lets you understand what your cash needs are and what you need to achieve your goals. And forecasting also gives you clarity on your priorities. Every business is going to have different priorities. And when you begin to forecast, you're going to learn where those priorities lie for yourself and your business. Now, on the buyer front, future potential is the only thing that they actually care about. So that growth story and that growth potential is going to be huge. And that's what they're going to be interested in as they're looking at your business. And this growth story needs to be, supported with some, real forecasting data that's achievable and believable. So you want to put something in front of them that makes sense, something to get them excited about, but don't be overly optimistic where you start missing some of these targets. It has to be realistic in their mind. And having a forecast that does have a good growth story and good growth potential may actually let you negotiate a higher multiple, because at the end of the day, when you have a large growth story, it'll get the buyer engaged and excited, and it'll be more likely that they'll increase the multiple. And also, having a growth story will get the buyer more comfortable with you and the numbers and your business, and that's more of a likelihood of getting the transaction closed. So that growth story gives the buyer that warm and fuzzy feeling that will ultimately lead to a premium valuation. It's important to understand that forecasting is a process. It's not a one-off event where you set it and forget it. It should be embedded in your culture and consistently reviewed and monitored and tweaked, hopefully on a regular basis, if not weekly, definitely at least monthly. But when we say the word forecasting, it does scare a lot of people. And I have to admit that first forecasting session will be a bit difficult, but as you develop the cadence for that, continually forecasting, it will get a bit easier for you. But the first session will be quite long and a lot of thought involved in it. But once you develop some type of system along the way, it will be easier for you to do. And it will change. The industry knows things happen, things change overnight. So when you're creating that base case forecast, you put your best foot forward, something that you honestly believe that you will hit and where you see the business is going. But like I said, things do change. So you continually have to update all of these forecast adjustments as they occur. So it could be next day, next month, but you have to keep your eye on it and continually tweak it to make sure that it stays accurate and up to date. And there's no legal liability with this. A lot of sellers are actually get a lot of anxiety putting any type of forecast in front of the buyer because they think there's some type of legal ramifications if they don't hit that forecast. That's not actually the case. That does happen quite often where you put a forecast in front of the buyer. Not ideal, especially when you're going to market, but there's no legal liability. You're not assumed to have to hit those targets, in the eyes of the law. So no issue there. And also, the buyer will use the forecast you put in front of them for the deal structure, but the deal structure will also cover a range of outcomes. So the base forecast, the goal for that, as we talked about, is accuracy. So in the scenario analysis, there's going to be a range of outcomes that are possible. But when you're creating your base case, you want to make sure that it's not too high. It's not that pie in the sky. It's not that blue sky scenario I was mentioning before, but it's also hopefully not too low. You don't want to sandbag and you don't want to get too close to that doomsday worst case scenario. That's also not going to help you out. So both of those scenarios we've seen in the past and can cause challenges when you shoot way too high or too low. That can cause challenges and issues during the deal process. And you definitely want to swing away from the traps. When you're creating this base case forecast, it's better to be conservative because month after month, as you are communicating with the buyer, you want to make sure you're hitting these targets and better if you're beating these targets. So it'll look better month after month if you are actually beating the targets that you had referenced prior to your figures coming in your financials. So you don't want to miss a forecast because it can definitely destabilize your deal. So very important that you keep you maintain your forecast, it's accurate, and that you don't overshoot or undershoot. Let's talk about the actual forecasting process. First and foremost, you have to have historical financials that are accurate. Ideally, it'd be a trailing 24 months, but at a bare minimum, at least a trailing 12 months. And that includes all financial statements, the accrual P&L, which is the income statement, the balance sheet, and also the cash flow. So it's crucial that you have that core base of having accurate financials because you can use your past trends to predict the future. So that'll be a big piece in looking forward. Also, as we mentioned, your forecast at base case should be achievable. So you have to have about an 80% likelihood that you'll actually hit it. And that goes for current products as well as new products. So all of those pieces will be baked into the forecast in your base case. And also analysis. So after you forecast month over month, you're going back in and making sure that you either beat that forecast, or if you didn't, you analyze why you didn't. So there's a variance analysis. You'll have to go back and see, what trends happened? What were some of the bottlenecks and constraints? Why did I not meet my forecast? So by continually forecasting, if every month as you sign off on your actual financials and see how you performed month over month, you go back and compare that to the forecast. Now that's where the forecasting will be very beneficial to you because you could immediately go in and fix some of those challenges. So, for example, you'll go back in and reforecast. If you find, for example, that your PPC spend went through the roof, you can kind of dig back into why that was. Or maybe your PPC spend was way too low and that actually affected sales as well. So you can kind of address all those issues, all those bottlenecks, all those constraints that you had, because had you not forecasted and compared it to your actuals, you wouldn't know that you'd be having these problems. So continually reforecasting puts you in a good position to target any pain points or any problems and solve them right away. Let's talk about building a revenue-based forecast in 5 steps. The first one I touched upon before is just really analyzing your historical financials. Hopefully, as I mentioned, you have at least a trailing 12 months of financials to go off of, because although that your future isn't going to rely 100% on, your past, but at least the current day, the short-term projections will probably mirror very similar trends that happened historically. And when I say historically, I mean, last month. So obviously when you're looking forward at the next month coming up, they'll probably be very similar. So there will be a lot of trends that you can carry over. So it's a good way to start building your forecast by looking at, last month's data and some trends, and also the current products. So obviously what you sold last month will probably apply very closely to the next month coming up as you forecast. So with those current products, the way you would forecast is you would go by SKU. You would actually enter into your forecasting tool, how many daily units, how many units you sell per day. And then obviously you put a list price in there as well. We typically use the average list price. We think that, if a seller does kind of change their price, 10 cents up, 10 cents down, it doesn't really make sense to tweak the forecast, the list price that much. But if, for example, they come and they say, okay, I'm increasing this this widget $10, that's a major change, and we'd update the forecast. But by keeping the average price of the year, the average selling price in, if you don't tweak your list price that much, that will cover it, so you don't have to go back and continually update, if you change the list price by pennies. And definitely don't put the desired selling price in there. It has to be realistic. And then also you want to forecast in the new products. This is also very, very important because this is where the growth story is going to come into play. And you want to be strategic about this. Again, it has to be achievable. You don't want to, in your forecast, especially in front of a buyer, put in, I'm launching 75 products next month, and they're all going to take off day one. They're going to have, 60% margins. So it's going to be, hard to actually pinpoint all of the product data you need and kind of gauge how the market will receive your product. So when you're doing this, you got to think about, how many months will it take me to get to this desired sales velocity? You're going to want to adjust the forecast to say, okay, so next month and maybe a few months after each launch, I'm going to be adjusting my PPC. So that's going to be increased. Maybe I'm decreasing my list price. So everybody knows that it takes time to launch new products. So you will want to show that, it takes about a good maybe 2-3 months for that product to be up and running and for you to be actually making a profit on it. So you want to capture all of those pieces within the forecast to make it realistic. Next, you want to capture any market expansion that you may have. Maybe you're going into, Amazon Mexico, Amazon Italy, or maybe you're going into Walmart. So all of these things, will be a potential and will add to the growth story. So if you definitely have them in the pipeline or have ideas, it is good to put them into your forecast. And not necessarily do you have to act on them, but it does show that, a buyer that you have thought and you do have a plan in place that, maybe you want to put it out into, the next 6 months or 9 months from now, because that may be something easier than launching products. But again, I think the product launch is probably holds more value, holds more weight in the eyes of a buyer rather than launching into other international markets. But, both are growth and both are considered expansion. So it's good to have them in the forecast. And lastly, you want to apply seasonality. And you're going to look at historical trends as well. But, for higher growth companies, it may be hard to mirror trends. For example, if you're doubling your revenue year over year, your past December may not look like your current December. So seasonality will kind of help gauge, when your product spikes. Let's just say you have a giftable product and it's, does really well during the holiday season. So if your typical run rate is about, a 1x, that's your standard base for selling a product. I'd say that, maybe December you sell 2 times that. So your seasonality factor would be a 2 in December, and then maybe a 0.9, you're selling 10% less in January because, the market kind of dies down a bit after holiday spend. So applying that seasonality will also let you, tweak month after month when your revenue spikes and when it drops down a bit. So once you bake that into the forecast, it'll give it a realistic look and it'll mirror past trends as well. So, you could apply those factors to make your forecast more robust. I also wanted to cover the steps involved to build your expense-based forecast. So accurate COGS is a must in the forecast. You want to make sure that most of your time, about 80%, is actually dedicated to monitoring and reviewing your COGS, because it's going to be a hot topic. That's going to be the first due diligence item that buyers will scrutinize and look for day one after LOI signing. So you want to make sure that all of your product costs are accurate. And also you want to make sure that all of your SKUs are profitable. Although your business may be profitable as a whole, you want to do a deep dive into each SKU analysis and make sure that each product, it makes sense to keep maintaining that product with that margin level. Also, when you're thinking about the paid media forecast, you want to make sure that any paid media budget you spend will also, be in line with the profitability targets you had per product. And you want to consider any paid media cost increases. Can your budget handle that per SKU if paid media does have to increase? And I touched upon in the revenue-based slide prior to this about some of the paid media spends you'll have to budget for when you're launching new products. It's probably going to be more so than your typical, product that you've had in your portfolio for a while, because obviously you want to rank. So we see that a lot of the paid media spend will be increased during the new launches. So you want to make sure you bake that in, as I talked about earlier. And then your SG&A, your general and administrative expenses, you want to review it historically. And like I said, a lot of the trends that applied previously will continue on. But then you also want to make sure that, as you have this growth story with these launching of new products and, international expansion, channel expansion, you want to make sure that you have the staff to support that. So maybe you want to put in some expenses along the way for a staffing budget to support your growth. And you also want to make sure you confirm what your variable expenses are versus your fixed expenses. Is there anything that you actually can get rid of along the way? As you're budgeting, you realize that, sometimes items you weren't even exactly sure you were paying those costs or those fees per month. So when you do a deep dive into your budget analysis, you kind of learn all of your spending habits, and things you may have overlooked in the past because you've been so busy do start to add up. If you have a subscription you're not using and maybe it's 20, 25 bucks a month, you'll go through and you'll cancel things like that. So now is the time to kind of put a fine comb through your budget and see if there's anything you could weed out. Add backs. So the add backs will be a key piece in your expenses. You'll obviously want to look back through your financials and look for any of those one-off expenses that were personal, or an expense that the buyer won't have to incur going forward. So those would be considered the add backs. And hopefully that your accounting system does kind of parse those out in its separate own chart of accounts, which is easy to identify. So it's best to have them in that separate line going forward. So hopefully that's been done. And then lastly, you want to analyze the profitability and adjust it. So you want to look for any of those anomalies. Your first forecast is probably likely not to lead to any of your goals. You may find that your first forecast you will probably miss, but that's okay. That's the importance of, doing that dry run a month after month of forecasting, comparing to actuals. That'll put you in a really good spot to, go in front of a buyer and have that forecasting confidence, have the forecasting chops that I've done this before. I know what I'm doing. So when you're making these changes, you got to rethink your assumptions. Don't just change numbers on a whim. Put some thought into it. Make sure things make sense, understand why things are changing. And your profitability may change, with any new strategies or new business decisions. But definitely having that eye on, your profitability continually throughout the process will make forecasting much more easier and beneficial in the long run. Let's talk about implementing and maintaining your forecast. So you've probably noticed that there's a lot of tools out there to help you maintain your forecast, help you build your forecast. Maybe you've got some internal tools, but point is there's a lot of different ways to forecast. There's no right tool or software to use or a right methodology. It's most important that you actually have a forecasting process in place. So whether it's Excel-based, whether it's a paid software, the most important point is that you're actually doing it and tweaking it and refining it on some type of cadence. Even if you have a simple forecast in place that just projects things annually, and you review it and update it monthly, that's better than having nothing at all. So having something, to review and some type of targets and goals is definitely a great first step. And, I'd say if you have no forecasting in place, start with that. And then, as you go monthly and review the forecast, you could add things to it. Maybe you just start off with doing a revenue-based forecast, and maybe you want to add the expenses in. But you're doing yourself a disservice if you don't do any forecasting at all. So just want to reiterate the importance of that. And just some action items for you. Complete your initial forecast, use the base case scenario forecast in the worksheets, and allocate hours to reviewing and updating your forecast, following the monthly review of your financials. So we find it's helpful if you actually put, some type of calendar entry in, reminding you to actually go in and reforecast after you review your financials, because, as we know, running a business can be quite complex and time consuming. So we don't want that to get lost in your usual business activities and daily operations. So definitely make this an important point to revisit as often as you can. Here's a forecasting example from the worksheet using the base case. You'll notice that the numbers in blue will be the numbers you could actually tweak. Just looking at these figures, which are put in here for example purposes, you'll see that exit year far off to the right is a 3. So you can adjust that based on the year you're thinking about exiting. And also you could adjust all of the growth rates. You'll see that it's based on that TTM period. So going forward, their future 12 months, the future 24 months, 36 months, and so on. So it's not the calendar year. It's definitely the TTM years going forward. So you can adjust, your revenue growth. You can adjust the COGS growth, the paid media, spend, SG&A. All of those things can be tweaked in this model as you see fit. And then obviously off to the right will be what the outcomes were. So the benefit of this is when you could see would it be a good time for you to actually exit and what the value would be. So for example, just using these numbers, if you say, okay, I have a strong target in my head that I only want to exit for 2 million. If that's the case, after you put in all of your realistic percentages as far as growth and spend for paid media, SG&A, then you could look at this grid and you'd say, okay, so that really means I can't exit until the F48 months. So that's kind of the way to think about it. Obviously, things will change, your forecast will update, but just looking at this template, it's a good idea to get comfortable with it and play around with it, enter your numbers realistic as possible. And if that's done, it will spit out some type of realistic ballpark valuation for, what your enterprise value will be. And also, multiples, try to keep them as realistic as possible. Don't go putting 10x multiples in there. Really won't give you a true valuation, but keep it realistic and it'll be a pretty good tool and pretty fun to play with as well. The beauty of forecasting is that it'll actually give you a guideline of a time frame to sell. And it'll let you know what you're driving for. When you're forecasting, you're setting goals and targets and expectations. And by forecasting, you know when you could actually meet these goals. You'll have a clear vision of when these goals will be achievable and how much growth potential you have. So just looking at this time grid below, it'll show you that there is actually a right time to sell. You don't want to sell when you're just starting the process and you're planning because you haven't reached your full growth potential. As you're budgeting and starting the forecasting process, you will be on the right road to growth potential. But at some point, it's going to be that just right moment where if you hold out any longer, there is that risk of declining. So we've had sellers in the past hold out thinking, oh, I don't want to sell because I'm doing so great. But in fact, that's actually when you should be selling. You should sell your business when you've reached your goals, your personal goals, your business goals, and you've achieved your growth rate. At that point, you should look into selling because there is that risk if, you don't sell, you could for some reason be on the decline. So you don't want to sell too early and you don't want to sell too late, but you do want to sell when you've reached your targets and your business is running pretty smoothly and has great margins and is something the buyers would be interested. If it's market ready, the numbers will dictate that as well. Just to recap, forecasting allows you to see the financial potential of your current growth plan, and it also will show you the impact of any changes you have in strategy, whether it be launching new products or expanding into international markets. And more importantly, forecasting helps you determine the best time to exit. So I hope you understand the value of forecasting as well as how it plays into getting a premium valuation when your time is ready to exit.